Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related material for 10 minutes as a break from the real world, where I attempt to answer a question from you, the viewer, listener, or reader. You can ask us a question in various ways. You can send us an email. You can comment on a previous podcast or YouTube video. You can send us a postcard. And of course, you can back us on Patreon, patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. There's 3 different levels of backer: Centurion, Optio, and Legionary. I got those in the completely wrong order. Legionary, Optio, and Centurion, $1, $5, and $10. Even get a copy of the magazine. Today's question comes from Jörn. Thank you, Jörn. Hi, AWA team. That's me, team of one. Just a few questions to ensure that you do not run out of stuff for podcasts. Thank you, Jörn. I'm going to answer one of Jörn's questions, and then I'll get to the others in future episodes. While reading Finis Britanniae, well, gosh, Jörn, thank you so much. That's my Finis Britanniae from Amberley last year, working on a second book for them at the moment. So whilst reading Finis Britanniae, love it. I was wondering how permanent institutions like dux or comes were. How permanent institutions like dux or comes were. Sorry, my emphasis was on the wrong syllable there. Similar modern-day military command seems to be a mix of ad hoc organizations and semi-permanent ones that last as long as the security situation demands. What do the sources say? All right, fabulous. Well, the interesting thing, of course, is that the sources are unreliable at this point in time from the 3rd century AD onwards. The word dux has been around for a long time. It's used by Julius Caesar, and in the 3rd century it seems to become a military commander in the reforms under the Tetrarchy. Especially they are around before those reforms. Again, one of the problems with a lot of comments about these reforms happen in this moment. They don't. They're a process that's been in the works and gets solidified or finalized under a particular person, and they then get named with them. I'll be doing an episode on the Marian reforms, which are not even regarded as the Marian reforms anymore. Similarly, in the 3rd century, the Diocletianic reforms are regarded as this, boom, they happen there. They're a process. Anyway, what you have is a dux who is a military commander, and they are split away in the 3rd century and under the Tetrarchy. So the dux military command is split from the governor of a province. And so you get the dux of a province. You also get other duces, which are duxes of a diocese, which is another reform that you get in the late 3rd century. For instance, if you've got the dux of a province, they're the dux of the army of that province. But then you get a dux like Dux Britanniae, who is the dux of the Diocese of Britain. And, of course, by the early 4th century, you've got perhaps 5 provinces in Britain. Britain starts as 1, it gets split into 2, then into 4, and then possibly into 5. And so the issue with that, of course, is that we keep talking about Britain or Britannia as a province. In fact, it's multiple provinces. It is a single diocese. Anyway, more of that later. And so what you then have is these dux are appointed to commands. We do get duxes named, and we get the name of a dux. Perhaps the most famous dux is King Arthur. Well, he's not King Arthur. He's Dux Bellorum Arthur. So he's the master of war, which is problematic. It's an actual Roman position, and it continues in the Byzantine Empire under the duces, and of course becomes various titles that we have in terms of the dukes that you have in royalty and nobility. What it seems to be, though, is that you've got a dux who's appointed to command an army, and indeed it seems to be a multi-year appointment, and that does not seem to be one which is standardized. I wonder, and I don't want to get into the idea of midterm elections or anything like that, but I wonder whether one of the stability aspects of these armies and these provinces under the 3rd century reforms is that the governor swaps. And again, governors in the early part of the Roman Empire are appointed for 3-year terms or 4-year terms. Some, like the proconsul of Asia and the proconsul of Africa, are a single-year term. Others are longer, and there are individuals who get extraordinary commands for longer than a normal governorship. Agricola being the most famous because he gets a double term in Britain in the late 1st century AD. So not 3 years, but he seems to get 2 in a row. Anyway, the interesting thing with that is I would imagine that the dukes being in charge of the military forces is they stay in command when the governor is swapped over. So essentially, that might make me argue that it's the same length of command as the governor of the province. But again, that's not a standardized thing either. But if you are going to say it's a 3-year term as a governor, perhaps it's a 3-year term as a dux, but it's split in half so that you were there for a year and a half under the old governor. You're then the experienced dux, and then you come in and the new governor comes and you're the experienced dux. So anyway, that would make sense. But again, so many things in Roman history and all history don't make sense. So but that's pure speculation on my part. Now, the dux are generally the commanders of the Limitanei armies, the frontier armies, the armies that are actually in the provinces. Obviously, there are several provinces that don't have an army because they're not on the border. And that's where the dioceses come in, that if you've got trouble in a province that doesn't have its own military force, the dux of the diocese can, in fact, take care of what's going on there. So what you've got is you have the dux within the province who commands the military forces of that province if they have military forces. You then have the dux of the diocese, and if the dux of the diocese, even though it's just the same title, dux, they are superior in rank to the dux of the province. So that dux can basically second your troops into their army if needed, rather than you seconding theirs. Okay. You've also got later, you've got the rise of the magister and the magistri. So the magister militums, and then you get magister militums of areas. You get magister militum who oversee a much, much larger area. The magister militum utriusque, for instance, Aetius and several others. So what you've got is a dux who is commander of an army in a province, a dux, annoyingly, who's the commander of all the armies in a diocese, who outranks the dux of a province, and you then have magistri militum, who are commanders of armies. More often than not, they're the comitatensis armies, the field armies, are magister-led, and the Limitanei armies are dux-led. The comes are peculiar because, again, you've got a comes who is on a border, such as in Britain. Famously, you've got the Finis Britanniae and the Count of the Saxon Sword, the comes of that. They've got troops in their provinces. But like in Britain, for instance, where you've got the Dux Britanniae, he can command the troops of both comes. So comes is under the dux, just like a count is under a duke, just so you've got a rule of thumb. So it's really interesting in that sense where the dux come from. We don't get any successions of duques. I think the closest we get is the kingdom of Soissons, where Aegidius is, well, he's a dux, or is he a magister militum? I'm not sure. But they use the term dux, and his son, Syagrius, succeeds him as dux. And it looks to be that they use the term dux rather than rex, which Gregory of Tours calls them rex. But it would seem that they only use the term dux because they wanted to be seen as a leadership that was a continuity of Roman rule rather than establishing themselves as kings. So they succeed, but their succession is a little bit incongruous. So it would seem, I would argue, that it's the same length of time in general as the governors of provinces. And by this time, of course, we're talking about the praeses of a province. And so if you've got a 3-year term or a 4-year term, or if your command is not considered to be threatening to the emperor, you might stay in that command longer. My favorite example from late Roman history is the proconsul of Asia, Festus of Tridentum, who holds that post from 371, maybe early 372, and he's not kicked out of office until 379. So he's held a 1 year command for 7 or 8 years. Now, again, that's not a border province. We think it has like 3 cohorts of troops in it as sort of like a police force. But if you've got a dux commanding that diocese army, would you keep that person for as long because you've got an example of a governor in office for 8 years? So hard to know. And, that's not a normal province governorship. That's a 1 year appointment that he holds for 8 in a row. That's crazy. Anyway, I digress. So the answer to your question, getting distracted, the answer, therefore, I think, is that we don't know how long the actual length of service was for these officers, but that they were lengthy without being too long. Very dissatisfying summation there. But anyway, join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks.